the outbreak of World War II, I thought it advisable to get out of Africa. Enemy agents were spreading insidious and dangerous propaganda among the natives who, in Rhodesia, were becoming more and more dangerous to white women. I thought of going to New Zealand, but, as I knew no one there, I changed my mind and arranged to go back to Canada, where I had many friends, quite forgetting that it was in the dollar block and not in the sterling area. On arriving in Victoria, BC, I went to the bank where I had formerly kept my account and tried to cash £300 worth of traveller's cheques. I was met with a blank refusal and told that they were not worth the paper they were printed on, and that they could not be converted into dollars anywhere in Canada. Although I knew some influential people in Victoria, who pulled every available string for me, it was without success. There I was, stranded in Canada without a cent. I was not alone in my predicament. There were many people in Canada, fleeing from England to escape the bombs who, owing to this extraordinary regulation were, for the time being, utterly destitute. Hostels had to be opened for their accommodation, supported by public subscriptions, and people who had enjoyed great wealth in England were living on charity in Canada. Thanks to having many kind friends, I fared better than most people from overseas, but no one who has not experienced the ordeal can have any idea of what it means to have absolutely no money, not even enough to buy something to mend the holes in one's stockings. The most ridiculous part of this extraordinary situation was that the Canadian government would not allow me to leave the country. I was trying to get to the Bahamas in the West Indies, partly because it was in the sterling area and partly because I had a cousin who was Chief Justice there. The governor at that time was the Duke of Windsor, who used to spend a large part of the year in the United States. During his absences my cousin officiated as acting governor, and I could expect to have a very gay time during his regime. But the officials controlling travel insisted upon my first producing my ticket to Bermuda, before they would allow me to obtain money from England to pay for it. I felt like Alice. Throughout this haggling, the owner of a sheep station in Australia wrote and asked me to go there to work. A large part of the country, he said, was suffering from drought, and there was a heavy mortality among the sheep. He added that a search for oil was planned in Australia, which would be a work of national importance. He wanted me to sail without delay. I was staying at the time with my old friends General Sir Percy and Lady Lake. The General thought that it was my duty to go, so, very unwillingly, I consented to give up my trip to the Bahamas to undertake the work which the station owner said would be waiting for me by the time I arrived, since he had great influence with the government. I was lent money to buy the ticket and was then allowed to obtain money from England to repay the loan and the many other debts which I had incurred. I was also able to buy some stockings to replace the holes which had adorned my legs. When I arrived in South Australia, I was met by the station owner, a tiny man with a huge wife, who gave me the staggering news that there had been a change of government and the one then in office would not consider employing me. I was furious. My thrilling trip to the Bahamas and the glamour of viceregal life had been sacrificed for nothing. I felt that I loathed Australia and everyone in it and vowed that I would get out of it as quickly as possible, despite the nervous strain of a sea voyage in wartime, with its danger and unpleasantness. But fate ruled otherwise. The Japanese were preparing to enter the war and I found it impossible to leave Australia. So, I left South Australia and went to Sydney, where the newspapers were full of a drought which was devastating large areas of eastern Australia, causing the death rate amongst sheep to rise to about 20 million, a figure that was nearly doubled in actual loss as, with the death of the ewes, no lambs were born. I went to the Graziers Association of New South Wales and offered the president my services as a water diviner. This led to my visiting a large number of sheep stations, many running from 20,000 to 30,000 acres and carrying from 10,000 to 20,000 sheep. Very soon I began to realize that the real Australia lay outside the cities, with the great open spaces, their unique fauna, the kangaroo, the wingless emu, the many strange marsupials and the gorgeous birds, all of which made up a fascinating country, which instead of hating, I was growing to like and understand more every day. In the sheep-raising areas in Australia, the value of land is based on its carrying capacity in sheep. Good land in a heavy rainfall area will carry 2 or 3 sheep to the acre in the hands of a competent grazier, but much fine wool is grown under very arid conditions where perhaps even 50 acres might be normally necessary to feed one sheep. This means that many stations in the dry areas are as big as an English county, with paddocks, or fields in England, covering some 20 square miles. Just before Christmas, in the hottest time of the year, I arrived at a sheep station in an area where the drought was particularly bad. After several days' work, I was asked to inspect the station's main well, which had to supply not only the house, but the all-important wool shed where thousands of sheep were shorn and a paddock carrying a large number of others. The well was causing great anxiety, for the supply was decreasing at an alarming rate. I expected to see a large well, some 60 feet or so deep and pumping, at least, 400 to 500 gallons an hour. Instead, I found a well about 15 feet deep, dug in clay and gravel, which could be pumped dry by the windmill in a very short time. When I had recovered from my astonishment that so little water should be made to do so much work, I had the windmill turned on and the well pumped dry. I then went down the well and found that there were 3 trickles of water coming into it, the largest being in the left-hand corner. So, I returned to the surface and followed all 3 with my rod, marking them on the ground, foot by foot, with meticulous care. For some time, I had felt sure that small streams, moving slowly in the earth, had a tendency to become blocked. I had tested a number of them from the surface and had, to my own satisfaction but without actual proof, found the block in them, with more water behind the obstruction than on the side towards the well. I also had an idea that wells which were fed by such streams could be brought back into production without any digging or boring and without disturbing the surface. The son-in-law of the owner of the property was with me. He was a station owner himself and a man of few words, a good person to work with. He never argued, which is a quality which any diviner will appreciate, and was willing to help me in every possible way. I explained my theory to him but, although he was obviously incredulous, he made no comment. I found a block in all 3 trickles and decided to work on the biggest, which was dribbling into the well through a narrow band of gravel. My idea was that a block might be cleared by hammering rhythmically on the surface of the ground, vertically above it, and I felt that here I had an opportunity of proving it. A large flat stone was placed exactly over the block, which was about 10 feet from the well. The stone was hit with a round-headed hammer, which was not so easy to do as it sounds, as the strokes of the hammer must be rhythmical, not jerky or uneven, and dull, because a sharp stroke would shatter the stone. My assistant did the hitting, while I traced the water with my divining tool, as it receded back to the block. When the water was about a foot beyond the block, I took over the rhythmic beating of the stone and my assistant went down the well. He returned with the good news that no water was coming in at the left-hand corner, where the biggest trickle had been. This was indeed satisfactory, since it proved that water could be stopped from running in the ground. The water was then driven back about 16 feet beyond the block, when the stone hitting was stopped, and the water was allowed to return in its channel towards the well. Every few minutes I tested it to see how far it had gone on its return journey. I was anxious to know what would happen when it reached the block. Would it pass through or not? I hoped that the vibration caused by hitting the stone would have loosened the sand and gravel, or whatever was causing the obstruction, but I was doubtful whether there was enough water to force its way through the barrier and carry the debris with it. It took longer than I had expected, but finally the block was successfully passed. When my tool A motoscope told me that the water was nearly at the well itself, my assistant went down into the well again to watch for the water, which we were so eagerly expecting. I spent some very anxious minutes waiting on the surface. Every time I called out to ask whether the water was coming through, the reply came back, "Not a drop. It's as dry as a bone," a statement which was just as disconcerting then as it had been pleasing before. I realized very forcibly during those few minutes that what was to me just an interesting experiment might have very serious consequences for the owners of the station, if I had spoiled their most important well. Suddenly a voice from below called out, "It's coming through," and I rushed to the side of the well and nearly fell into it myself in my excitement at seeing a muddy little stream appear. It cleared in a few minutes and a small clear running stream, no longer a trickle, made a little channel for itself in the sandy bottom of the well. The water had come back, The blockage was cleared, and a definite answer had been given to the question whether running water could be stopped and driven back, as well as clear a blockage in a stream. The two other trickles were treated in the same way, but with much less excitement, for the newly released stream was then gaining on the windmill and there were several feet of water in the well. So, we hadn't the pleasure of seeing the trickles drying up and returning as running streams. It was Christmas Eve and the station owner said that it was the most wonderful Christmas present he had ever received. 12 months later, I again visited the well on Christmas Eve, and was pleased to hear that it was as good as ever, although most of the shallow wells and dams in the neighborhood were already dry. One thing I learned in this drought-stricken country was the enormous value of quite small supplies of water. Yet it was extraordinarily difficult to convince landowners that to get dependable and permanent water in decent quantities they must be prepared to go down 50 to 100 feet for it. I would like to warn other diviners that, when engaged in unblocking streams and bringing wells back into production, they should make sure the well isn't sunk in rock, with a rock bottom, through which the water comes up in cracks and fissures. I experimented on a rock well, about 60 feet deep, which was disused, fortunately for me, as only about 30 gallons an hour could be pumped out of it instead of the original 500. I found there was a very big blockage in the stream leading to it, so big that two of us worked on it on different stones, hitting together in rhythm. I expected a really good result, but, after tracing the returning water foot by foot to the well, I was astonished to find that no water emerged, not even the original 30 gallons. The water had cleared the big obstruction in returning, so the only explanation left was that the rubble from the block had cemented all the cracks in the bottom of the well and prevented the water coming through. In ordinary circumstances I would have recommended blasting the bottom of the well with a small charge of dynamite, but being wartime, this was unobtainable. I thought this was a most interesting experience, but, unfortunately, the owner of the station thought otherwise and was not a little annoyed, especially as he had done most of the hard work of hammering on the stone. This has made me most careful to examine the strata of a well before making any experiments on it. I have often been asked whether depth makes any difference in driving back the water and unblocking streams. I certainly think it does, and I doubt whether it could be done at any great depth. End of part 22.